The year is 1090, and the place is Alamut, a great fortress set high in the Alborz Mountains of modern-day Iran. Outside its walls, the land is serene, likely frosted white due to the winter, but inside, tensions are high. The garrison commander, Mahdi, has worn himself thin persecuting the local religious population, the Nizari Ismailites, but has still come up short of finding their leader. Then, after all hope seemed lost, the final nail in the coffin of his rule came on that wintry evening, when he was approached by a local peasant mystic who had been teaching the castle's children. Politely, the mystic informed Mahdi that he no longer had dominion over his castle, and that it was his to rule. No doubt frightened and angry, the Lord commanded his soldiers to capture the mystic for execution, only to find that none of them would budge at his orders. At that moment, Mahdi knew this peasant mystic was the true Lord of Alamut. That mystic's name? Hassan-i-Sabah, the leader of the Nizari Ismailites and the founder of the Order of Assassins. I was 7 years old when Assassin's Creed 1 hit the shelves, and the following year, around my birthday, while perusing the local GameStop and coming up empty of anything I wanted to play, I was recommended it by one of the cashiers. They lauded it as a historical hack and slash, and informed me that the world within the game was expansive and immersive. Not knowing or valuing these cynical industry buzzwords at the ripe old age of 8, I bought it because I saw a cool hooded dude with a cool shiny blade on the cover. In fact, I was so ignorant of the game's history that throughout my entire playthrough, I assumed the game took place in biblical times. Of course, you can understand how confused I was when Jesus, or Moses, didn't make an appearance. Nevertheless, I loved the experience I had while playing. So much so that I made a conscious effort to explore every nook and cranny of the game's setting, to glean as much as I could about the actual events that took place there. Because of this, I credit it as the first spark I had as a kid which ignited my fascination with our world's history. So, with Assassin's Creed Valhalla right around the corner, I think it's only fitting that I would later choose it as the topic for my first video on this channel, just so I could give it a go all these years later and separate the facts from the fiction to tell you the history behind Assassin's Creed 1. But first, before we can get there, like every other The History Of video I'll upload on this channel, I want to give a quick little review on the game's mechanics and systems, since I won't be mentioning them at any point later in the video. So let me get this right out of the way out of the bat. Gameplay-wise, the game's a hot mess. From frustrating gameplay to game-breaking bugs. To awful voice acting.
Best hurry. No doubt you're eager to put your tongue to his boot.
Another word and I'll put my blade to your throat.
Better to let them chase you for a while before striking back. But it is disrespectful for me to tell a master how he should behave in combat. Forgive me, master.
It's easy to see how far the series has come since its first iteration. Now, don't get me wrong, none of this is a deal breaker for me. The game is oozing with passion for not only the time period it's trying to recreate, but the weird New World Order conspiracy story it's trying to tell. The developers were clearly neck deep in the game's real setting when they made this, and to me that's very respectable, even if they do stray a little far from the actual history. The First Crusade was called in 1095, in response to the mistreatment of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land and the loss of Byzantine territory in Anatolia. This proclamation made waves across the eastern and western worlds, and would define the lives of millions to come. Running parallel to this was Hassan-i Sabbah and his Assassiyun, who would make great waves of their own in the east, striking out at the very rulers who had oppressed them just years before. Their first great feat was the assassination of the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk in late 1092, which would fracture the Seljuk Empire into numerous warring states, all vying for control of the territory. Almost single-handedly, Hassan had crippled the empire that had lorded over him in the years past, and effectively softened the region for the invading Christians. But perhaps the greatest fracturing of the Arab world would come in July of 1099, when the First Crusade came to a close, and out of its ashes, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, containing the states Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and of course Jerusalem itself, was established. To say this news surprised everyone was an understatement. In fact, this new development shook the known world. Not many expected the Crusaders would be victorious. The sheer audacity of the undertaking and its ultimate success would reaffirm the faith of Christianity as a whole, convincing many that God truly was on their side, and spurring them to travel to the Holy Land to make pilgrimages of their own. In response to this great influx of pilgrims, the kingdom would form multiple monastic military orders in order to protect its citizens from roving bandits or armies. Two among these orders were the Knights Hospitalier and the Knights of Solomon's Temple, or as we more commonly refer to them, the Knights Templar. Now, the Knights Hospitalier were founded right after the Crusader conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, but the Templars were founded 20 years afterward, in 1119. The fact that they would still be founding military orders so long after the kingdom's creation is a clear indicator that things weren't exactly hunky-dory in the Holy Land. In fact, the region was so unstable post-Crusade that Hassan's Assassiyun were able to establish themselves an independent state there, using the very same tactics they had employed to seize Alamut and its surrounding cities. Something like this would have been unthinkable just 20 years before, but times had changed, and the mountain fortress Masyaf was seized by the Assassins in 1140, cementing their rule over the region. As you would guess, their proximity to the Holy Land did lead to a rivalry between them and the Knights Templar, but I'm going to get this right out of the way immediately. They were not mortal enemies like the game would suggest. Both orders just had too many enemies to count, and would never single one out as their main focus. Instead, they were more like rival mafia gangs, bullying each other for tribute and territory. One such instance of this came in 1152, when Count Raymond II of Tripoli was assassinated by the Assassiyun at his city's southern gate. The reason for this is unknown, but what is known are the consequences. The Templars demanded the assassins pay them 2,000 Byzantine coins as reparation. It was protection money, and we all know what happens when you don't pay protection money. Anyways, by then the year is 1152, and much has happened in the 53 years following the First Crusade. In 1144, the county of Edessa fell into Muslim hands, sparking the Second Crusade. Long story short, this crusade was a joke. It didn't accomplish anything. After court rivalries led to the abortion that was the failed siege of Damascus, everyone just kind of went home, and no real gains were made by the Crusaders. This colossal victory over the Christian forces would bolster morale in the Muslim world, and that disunity that had plagued them in the decades prior was beginning to fade. Until, by 1176, it was gone. Islam in the region had united under one great Egyptian lord, Salah ad-Din, Romanized Saladin, and one word rose in a chorus from their throats: jihad. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem fell to Saladin's army. The news of this great defeat shook Europe to its core and rocked the very foundations of Christianity. Pope Urban III himself was so devastated by the development that he died of a heart attack just minutes after hearing of it. I'm sure you can guess what came next. Just as the Muslims had cried out for jihad, one word hung in the air above Europe: crusade. 3 great kings would answer that call: Richard I the Lionheart of the Angevin Empire, Peter II of the Kingdom of France, and Friedrich I of the Holy Roman Empire. But both Peter and Friedrich wouldn't make it very far into the war. Peter would leave before the first siege had ended, and Friedrich would die in Anatolia, after falling from his horse and drowning in a mud puddle due to the weight of his armor. Despite these losses, a great Crusader army still gathered at the port city of Acre to besiege it, and used it as a staging point to strike out at Saladin's army. The grueling siege would last nearly 2 years, but the Christians stuck it out, and by July 1191 the city was seized. Around this time, after the capture of Acre, the game begins, and with it, the next chapter of this video. In the shadows of the Syrian mountain range on Nusairiyah, the ancient stronghold Masyaf stood, glowering over the Nizari domain. Inside, the Syrian branch of the Assassiyun lived, following the same strictures as their Iranian brethren in Alamut. Theirs was a caste system, with the Grand Headmaster at the top, the great propagandists or scholars below him, then the normal propagandists below them, then the common folk, or the citizens. And finally, at the very bottom, the adherents, or the soldiers. The adherents are, of course, the most important members of the order to us, because they're the ones who actually committed the assassinations, but without all the pizzazz shown in the games. Instead of white robes and signature hoods, they dressed in the clothes common to the area. Instead of hidden wrist blades, they carried hidden daggers. And instead of making a slick getaway after a public assassination, they usually just allowed themselves to be slain by guards or bystanders. Unlike the assassins we play in the games, these fedai, as they were called, had no real sense of self-preservation. They were perfectly happy to die after they had killed their target, since they were convinced that after the job was done, their Grand Headmaster would send his angels to carry them to heaven. How was this intense devotion inspired in the minds of these soldiers? Well, as Marco Polo stated in his biography, The Travels of Marco Polo, it was as thus. The old man had, in a valley between 2 mountains, the largest and most beautiful garden that ever was seen. There grew all the finest fruits in the world, and it was adorned with the most beautiful houses and palaces, and populated with ladies and damsels unequaled in beauty and the amorous arts. In it there flowed conduits of wine, milk, and honey, and the old man made his followers believe it really was paradise. In it, he admitted none but the ones he wished to make assassins, and they were allowed to stay there for a few days, after which they were drawn into a deep sleep and taken from the garden. They then went humbly to the old man, worshipping him as a prophet, and saying that they much desired to die in order to return there. Hassan was said to have induced this stupor using hashish, and would continually offer hashish to the adherents before their missions to bolster their confidence. This is where the term hashashin was said to have originated, and over time formed into the word assassin. Now, none of this seems very likely to me. It's more likely that the Fedai were just brainwashed from an early age, like modern terrorists today. I mean, 2 parts of the Assassiyun caste are literally called the propagandists. What do you think their jobs were? Besides, it's really hard to get anything done when you're high off your ass. Cheech and Chong could barely get out of their car, let alone assassinate a high-ranking official.
Hey man, am I driving okay?
I think we're parked, man.
Oh, shit.
But I digress. Back to Masyaf, and that location's sole assassination target, Al-Mualim. Rashid al-Din Sinan, called Al-Mualim in the game, was born between 1131 and 1135 in Basra, Iraq. Not much is known of his early life, except that he ran away to Alamut at an early age after an argument with his brothers. There, he was trained in the Assassin's Creed, and rose to become one of its most esteemed scholars. Because of this, he was sent to Syria, to become that branch's headmaster. There, he held the same, if not more, esteem as the actual leader of the Nazaris, Hassan II, successor to Hassan-i Sabah, and would order plenty of assassinations without any input from his overlords in Alamut. Among these were 2 failed attempts on the incredibly powerful Sultan Saladin, who I mentioned before was the conqueror of Jerusalem. Yeah, Rashid was kind of a badass. In response to the attempts on his life, Saladin would besiege Masyaf in 1176, only to call it off after finding a poisoned dagger at his bedside. Now, history is unclear as to who actually planted the dagger. In the Assassin's Creed lore, Altair's father Umar is said to have done it. But Saladin was convinced that he saw Headmaster Rashid himself leaving his tent that night. Whether or not this claim was true, it really gives you an idea of how intimidating Rashid al-Din Sinan was to the Sultan, and this intimidation would ultimately result in an alliance between them, mostly because Saladin feared the Crusaders might use the Assassiyun against him. Like I said before, badass. But the Siege of Masyaf isn't the only classic story attributed to Rashid's Syrian Brotherhood. Its most famous story would take place in 1197, 4 years after the death of Rashid in 1193. Here, Rashid's successor, Abu Mansur, was met by the then King of Jerusalem, Henry II, and upon being asked of the submissiveness of his subjects, Abu Mansur ordered 2 Fidai to throw themselves from the walls to their deaths. Rashid was said to have ordered death leaps like these all the time before his death, and Abu Mansur's was just one among many such leaps. This, of course, is mirrored in the game, when Al-Mu'alim orders his Fidai to take a similar leap.
Go to God!
In real life, though, there weren't any hay bales to save them. Rashid al-Din Sinan would die in 1193, likely due to natural causes. And no, he never found the Apple of Eden. In Assassin's Creed 1, Acre is depicted as this glib, gray place, poor and half destroyed. It's easily my least favorite location in the game, just because of how historically inauthentic it is. You mean to tell me that the Crusaders can't pick up the bodies out of the streets, but they can pitch the roofs? I understand that Ubisoft was trying to give visual cues that Europeans own Acre by giving it European architecture, but what reason could they possibly have to slope the roofs? The famous desert snows of the Middle East? In reality, its roofs would have been flat or domed, like this. But I digress. I got 3 Crusader lords to cover in this chapter. I can't waste all my time nitpicking this post-nuclear Acre. So let's get into it, starting with the city's first target, Garnier de Nablus. Nablus, called Naplouse in the game for whatever reason, was the 10th Grand Master of the Knights Hospitalier from 1190 to his death in 1192. Honestly, his depiction in Assassin's Creed couldn't be farther from what he actually was. In the game, he's this mad doctor, obsessed with healing the minds of his patients using some pretty sadistic means. But in reality, it's likely he never picked up any surgical tools at all. He was a knight, as were the other Grand Masters of his order. In fact, he would fight alongside Richard the Lionheart against Saladin's forces at the Battle of Arsuf, just a few months after the Siege of Acre. And ultimately, it was his acts of valor on the battlefield that would lead to the Christian victory there. Honestly, I have no idea why Ubisoft decided to make him a doctor. Yeah, I get the name Knights Hospitalier does mean Knights of the Hospital, but by 1191 the order was more knight than hospital, and had fought numerous battles in defense of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Garnier de Nablus was just one in a long line of warrior lords who ran the Knights Hospitalier, so he never could have been the sadistic maniac he's presented as in the game. He was a soldier, so instead of dying with dishonor from an assassination in 1191, the Grand Master actually died in 1192, likely due to injuries he sustained fighting honorably at the Battle of Arsuf. In my opinion, if Ubisoft absolutely had to have a mad doctor as an assassination target, Master Cibran, the city's third target, would have been a way better choice. Literally all that's known about Cibran is that he founded a military hospital at Acre during its siege for the purpose of healing German soldiers. Situated along the coast and using a ship's sail as its roof, the hospital, under Cibran's direction, worked tirelessly to heal injuries and stop the spread of disease. Perhaps recognizing this, the Crusaders provided Cibran with a hospital in Acre after it was captured, where he would work for the rest of the war. And though this little hospital would serve as the nucleus for the Teutonic Knights, he was no more than a philanthropist. But in the game, he's described as the
newly appointed leader of the Knights Teutonic,
as if there were more before him. In reality, the Teutonic Knights wouldn't be recognized as an order until 1192, and wouldn't be established as a military order until 6 years later in 1198. Before then, they didn't even have Grand Masters, and by then, Cibran must have not have been in the picture, since Heinrich Walpott was chosen as the Order's first Grand Master. That's why it's puzzling to me that Cibran seems to have so much influence in comparison to Garnier de Nablus, when in terms of political power, he wouldn't have been more than a gnat to the powerful Crusader Lord. You see now why I think their roles should have been switched? That would have solved a lot of problems I have with this city. Of course, that wouldn't solve all the problems I have with this city. Even if you were to take Nablus and place him in Cibran's position, he still wouldn't have the level of power over the docks and ships that Cibran is presented as having, to the point of being able to blockade the city. The only person with that level of power would be the city's lord. In the game's case, William of Montferrat, the third and last assassination target we'll cover in this chapter. Of the three, William de Montferrat is by far my favorite. The story of the actual historical figure he's based on is just awesome. It's a staple of Crusades history, and is what ultimately introduced the assassins to the Western world. Unfortunately, William wasn't that historical figure. It was his son, Conrad de Montferrat. For some reason, despite the glaring historical incongruities I mentioned earlier, Ubisoft decided it would be too inaccurate if Conrad was chosen as the assassination target, since Conrad died in 1193. So instead, they chose his father, who had no real involvement in the Third Crusade. He was in his 80s by 1191, and though he did die that year, it was at Tyre, and likely a natural death. Conrad, on the other hand, was greatly involved in the Third Crusade. In fact, his entire future was hinged on its outcome. You see, during the siege of Acre, King Richard and King Peter were pressed to throw in their lot for who would become the future king of Jerusalem after the war was won. Richard would choose Guy of Lusignan, who had been the king of Jerusalem but was said to have lost his claim due to Saladin's crushing victory at the Battle of Hattin, which would open the way to Jerusalem following the Second Crusade. Peter, on the other hand, chose Conrad, since he held a claim to the throne through his marriage with Isabella, the then Queen Regent of the Holy Land. In 1192, it was put to a vote, and much to the dismay of Richard and Guy, the barons voted unanimously for Conrad to be their king. But his kingship wouldn't last. On April the 28th, while returning home after having lunch with a friend, Conrad was stabbed to death in the streets of Acre before the eyes of its citizens. The very violent and very public manner of his death should make it clear to you who did the killing. Rashid's Order of Assassins. Now, historians know that the Assassiyun were the perpetrators of the killing, but they're still unsure as to who ordered it. The most common belief, which is the one I agree with, is that Richard himself called in the hit. I mean, he had ample motive for the killing, as you heard before. He would get nothing but benefits from Conrad's death, but it can't be proven. Want to know why I think Richard ordered the killing? Well, it's for one simple reason. Although he denied any involvement, Richard's chroniclers, probably at his behest, wrote that Conrad didn't die in the streets of Acre. Instead, he was brought home to lie on his deathbed, where he would supposedly tell Isabella that, upon his death, his lands and titles should be granted to Richard or his representative, Guy. Reads like a medieval O.J. Simpson book, doesn't it? Well, regardless of the motive or the time of death, Conrad would die on April the 28th, 1192. And no, he was never a member of the Knights Templar. In stark contrast to Acre, Damascus is presented as this bright city with lively streets and a skyline of sun-kissed minarets. It's by far my favorite location in the game. Not for any historical reasons, though. In fact, only one of its assassination targets was an actual historical figure, and even then, he's only loosely based on the actual person. No, my love for the city is purely for superficial reasons. I'll just come right out and say it. I'm a sucker for classic Arabic architecture. There's just something about the rolling domes and rounded towers that gives you the impression that the city just grew out of the desert. And the color palette they use, it's perfectly dusty and sunburnt, as much a part of its landscape as, say, an oasis or a mountain. As I thought about this chapter, I slowly began to realize why I don't like Acre so much. It just doesn't fit its setting. It's too dark and drab. The only positive feelings I had while traveling Acre was thinking about how beautiful the other locations looked in comparison. Personally, I think this was purposeful by the developers to give the players this subconscious idea that Europe, or European control, was somehow inferior to the Middle East. I call it Kingdom of Heaven syndrome, because that movie is clearly engineered by Ridley Scott for the same outcome. Let me show you. Here's Europe in the Kingdom of Heaven. Notice the miserable color palette of deep blue and dark gray. And here's the Middle East in the Kingdom of Heaven, with its multicolored, lively palette. And tell me which you have a higher opinion of.
Coincidence? I think not!
But let's move on to the only semi-historical assassination target in Damascus, Jubayr al-Hakim. Ibn Jubayr, the real figure Jubayr al-Hakim is based on, was born in 1145 in Valencia, Spain, back when it was controlled by the Islamic Moors. He was smart, well-read, and deeply religious. So, in 1182, when he was forced to drink a sinful amount of wine by a Moorish lord he served under, he decided he would make the voyage to Mecca to cleanse his soul of the evil act. The journey was very dangerous, and as you can see from this map, very long. But through it all, Jubayr kept his head held high, even keeping a journal documenting the things he experienced on his adventure. This journal, and its colorful depictions of the things he saw, is ultimately the reason we know him today. I mean, this guy was a pioneer in the field of journalism. He would give these incredible descriptions of the places he went to. Then he'd tie it in with religious significance to make sure it hit home for the reader. He'd hit your emotional core rather than just feed you information like many of the other travel journals did at the time. And this led to his story being remembered over many of his contemporaries, even into today. Jubayr couldn't have been farther from his endgame depiction. He wasn't a book burner, he was a scholar. He wasn't a murderer, he was a peaceful pilgrim. He never served beneath Saladin, but did praise his rule over the Middle East. And he wouldn't die in 1191 to an assassin's blade, instead dying in 1217 in the city of Alexandria, after having cemented his legacy as one of the great medieval Arab poets. And, well, what else do I have to say about Damascus? Like I said, only Jubayr was real, so there's nothing left to talk about on that front. The Umayyad Mosque is pretty cool, and it's where Saladin will be buried when he dies in 1193. And, nope, that's about it. On to Jerusalem. I don't think there's a more apt title for this chapter than the Mixed Bag. It of course relates to the fact that the city has both Christian and Muslim assassination targets, but it also relates to the city itself and the mixed bag of religions and cultures that live within it. At its center, the Dome of the Rock, the focal point of all religious conflict in the region, stands. A beautiful, symmetrical testament to the golden age of Arabic architecture. This is where Abraham is said to have prepared the sacrifice of his son, and where Muhammad was said to have ascended to heaven. The name Dome of the Rock comes from the foundation stone at its center, said to be the first part of the earth brought into existence, and where many important events of biblical times took place. Among them, the covenant between God and Moses, and where the game claims the Ark of that covenant is kept. I'm sure now you can get an idea of just how important the Holy City is to the three Abrahamic religions, and why so many people have flocked to it to live and worship over the years. To illustrate this mix of culture and creed, the city is awash with color, and as a result is stunningly beautiful. While it isn't as organic and worn as Damascus, it's still an awesome city to traverse, and the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim landmarks are really a wonder to behold, as I'm sure they are in real life. But Assassin's Creed is not real life. The chief indicator of this being that 2 of the 3 assassination targets were not real people, and the one thought to be based on a real person is so loosely based that I don't even know if Ubisoft intended it. Majd ad-Din is the character I'm referring to, and Baha ad-Din is supposedly his real-life counterpart. How was this conclusion drawn? Well, they both have a connection to Saladin, and they both have similar names. That's it. But Baha ad-Din was just Saladin's biographer, and one of his advisors, not a ruler. And he was a learned scholar, not a brutal killer. And he for sure didn't die in 1191, since he would be an eyewitness to the most important moments of the Third Crusade, writing one of the most extensive chronicles of the entire conflict. Instead, he died long after the war had ended, in 1234, meaning he didn't just see the Third Crusade end, he also saw the end of the 4th, 5th, and 6th. And no, after all those crusades, I don't think a Christian knight attended his funeral. Following the capture of Acre, the Crusader army marched south to take Jaffa, to serve as a staging point to make strikes at Jerusalem. The march was long and slow, and near its end the men were exhausted and nearly mutinous. They had been harried constantly by Saladin's forces, but were never given the order to strike back at them. It's really a testament to Richard the Lionheart's massive charisma that he was able to keep these men in line when they were so desperate for retaliation. But Richard had a plan. Knowing Saladin's force outnumbered his 2-to-1, he figured a defensive strategy was his best bet in winning the war. He didn't want to overextend anywhere, figuring just one mistake here would cost him everything. That's why, on September 7th, 1191, when Richard's force met Saladin on the fields outside of the forest of Arsuf, Richard maintained a defensive line. He didn't want a battle. He wanted to hold out until the Arabs grew tired and left. This doctrine of stillness angered the Christian forces, since they were subject to constant barrages of arrows, which they couldn't respond to. As they fell left and right on the field, Richard's charisma stretched to its breaking point to keep the men together. Then, it broke. On his left flank, the Knights Hospitalier were bloodthirsty, and roused to confidence by their Grand Master, Garnier de Nablus. He had sent messengers constantly to Richard, begging for the order to charge, but still Richard didn't want to move his force, for fear that fighting here would weaken his army's overall strength. Fed up with his king and desperate to make his name, Garnier gave the order to charge, and his Knights Hospitalier swept the field, crashing into Saladin's force. No doubt surprised by this, Richard also gave the order to charge. His hand was forced, He couldn't allow that many men to be slaughtered without at least making an effort to save them. At his order, the entire army lanced into Saladin's line, fighting like mad dogs to push them off the Hospitalier. In the thick of it was Richard himself, hewing through the enemy, and with him, Robert de Sable, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and the last assassination target we have to cover. Robert de Sable was born in 1150 in the French half of the Angevin Empire. He was one of the king's strongest vassals, and as vassals commonly did, he threw in his lot for who the king of the empire would be in the revolt of 1173 to 1174. He chose Henry the Young King and fought valiantly for his claim to the throne. Unfortunately for Henry, the revolt was crushed, but for Robert, everything just kind of went back to normal, since he would lose little to nothing for his participation in the revolt. In fact, afterward, he was still in the favor of the Angevin kings, and Richard the Lionheart even loved him so much that he would use his influence to have Robert made Grand Master of the Knights Templar, when their former master, Gerard de Riedfort, was beheaded by Saladin in 1189. Unlike the Robert de Sable we're shown in the game, who's deeply devoted to furthering the goals of the Templars, the real historical figure was largely uninterested in the order he led. For example, when he was given rule over the island of Cyprus by King Richard, he was expected to create a fortress there, as the Hospitalier did on Rhodes and Malta. But instead, he sold it to King Guy of Jerusalem, which I'm sure you can imagine the power-hungry Robert depicted in the game never would have done. I mean, the real Robert wasn't even a member of the Templars when he was given rule over them, as the other Grand Masters had been, and likely wasn't very interested in the Order's affairs. He just needed a strong force to wage war with, and that's why he would spend the majority of his time as Grand Master fighting the war, and pretty much ignoring everything else. He's exactly what King Richard wanted, so he could rein in the Templars when battle finally came. I honestly doubt Richard would have appointed the fanatic in the game. That would have been a terrible strategic decision. Robert de Sable died in 1193 of natural causes, not at the Battle of Arsuf, and definitely not at the hands of an assassin. Speaking of the Battle of Arsuf, let's get back into it and finish out the last chapter of this video. Against the charge of the Christian forces, the Muslim lines were broken. In mere moments, the defenders had become the attackers, and Saladin was on the back foot, arranging his men in a defensive formation against the Crusaders. This formation wouldn't last, though, as the entire Christian army fell upon them, leading them to retreat. King Richard's army had won the day, and Saladin's was crippled, limping to Jerusalem to reorganize and reinforce in preparation for the defense of the city. That defense would never come, though, since after the Battle of Arsuf, the Christian forces began to fall apart. The dynastic disputes between Guy and Conrad de Montferrat would begin here, and further divide the forces that were already beginning to fray. Then, after the Battle of Jaffa, where Saladin launched an offensive against the newly taken city and was pushed back, King Richard, who was worried about a dynastic dispute back in Europe, would negotiate a weak peace between the two forces, wherein Christians would be allowed into Jerusalem, but it would remain under Muslim control. And so ends the Third Crusade, and my explanation of the history behind Assassin's Creed 1. That's it. That's the video. The first video I've ever done, period. Be sure to leave your comments and criticisms down below. And don't think just because this is my first that you should hold back. Lay into me if you have to. No criticism is bad criticism here on Tim Talks. And hey, while you're at it, be sure to hit the subscribe and bell buttons to be notified of my next video. Also, be sure to swing by my Twitter to vote on the next video I do. You got two choices. We hop right into the Renaissance history behind Assassin's Creed 2 and the real-life deaths of the Assassin and Templar orders, or we dive into the history of the dying Wild West and the Mexican Revolution with Red Dead Redemption 1. Or, if you got an idea of your own, feel free to leave it in the comments, and perhaps I'll add it to the vote. Well, that's all I got left to say, so peace! Hey. Wicka, wicka, wicka! Break it down. Wicka, wicka, wicka!